This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Can we trust the New Testament as a historical document or collection of documents? Was Jesus a real person that's mentioned in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Those writings are really old. How do we know if what we have today is what they originally said? And what about some of those other Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter? You might be thinking, wait a sec, other Gospels? I've never heard of those. Well, they're out there, and they're ancient too. But if they're Gospels about Jesus, then why aren't they in the Bible? Those are a whole bunch of questions that aren't new, but have actually been discussed over centuries and millennia. Henry Smith got a chance to talk with Dr. Craig Evans about these questions. Dr. Evans is a biblical scholar and a professor at Houston Baptist University. He founded the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute, the only center in North America dedicated to the manuscript discoveries in the desert near the Dead Sea and material finds of the Qumran community. He's written several books on the historical Jesus, archaeology, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And today, he's going to talk about his book called Jesus and the Manuscripts. Here's Henry.
Dr. Evans, welcome back to Digging for Truth. It's good to see you again.
Good to be back.
It's great to have you. You have a book out, Jesus and the Manuscripts. Love the title. Fantastic book. I spent a lot of time reading through it. I enjoyed it, and we're hoping our audience will do the same. I thought maybe we'd start with, in the beginning of your book, you talk about what your overarching purpose is. You kind of give like 3 big points of what you're trying to accomplish. Maybe you could start with that, Dr. Evans.
I'm concerned that many people who take the Bible seriously, and especially Jesus and the Gospels, are not aware of the nature of the literature itself. That they don't have a good grasp of the manuscripts of the Gospels and other New Testament writings, how many we have, how old they are, how good they are. And they're unaware of how Jesus, in fact, appears in a variety of other traditions. They can be Christian within the church, but also traditions outside Christendom, such as in the Quran, in rabbinic literature, and in other sources. They're unaware that Jesus's name is invoked in magical texts, for example, for protection and healing and so on. So there's a lot of literature out there, and some of it is very technical and hard to get into. So I wanted to write for 2 audiences. I know it's a bit over the head of some popular readers, but every time Greek is used or Latin or Hebrew or something like that, it's always translated.
Yes.
So you shouldn't be put off. You can access it. But I'm thinking of the scholar too. There are a lot of scholars out there that don't know a lot of this stuff. And I wanted to help everybody on both sides of it, the scholars and non-experts alike, and just review all of the literature from antiquity that I think is really important, that says something about the Jesus of history.
Yeah, it's tremendous. That's exactly the sense you get into. When I was reading through the book, I felt there's depth there, but I could come out and go back in. And then if I wanted to go deeper into something, the footnotes are copious in the bibliography. So it really does serve both purposes. And I think that's important. I like the way you survey sort of aspects of debate and sort of help people critically assess how the evidence is ignored or abused and that sort of thing. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, yes, and this happens on all sides. People who take Scripture very seriously, they believe that the Bible is truth and read it accordingly, and yet there's a lot of naivete and misunderstanding of how the Bible came about, the text of the Bible, just a failure to understand the whole dynamics of handwritten manuscripts. And of course, skeptics, they're even worse. They don't know where the Bible came from, what went into the canon. They fall for ridiculous popular ideas like, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, that Emperor Constantine is the one who chose the Gospels, for example, or some of the extreme stuff that we see in Bart Ehrman, who does know better, but was in popular writing suggesting that who knows how the text originally read. There are so many mistakes and so many changes. Nobody really knows how the Greek New Testament originally read. The Gospels have been changed, and all the rest of that. There's a lot of stuff that really is nonsense on a popular level, but even in scholarly circles, a lack of understanding. And so you get these crazy claims, and there's just no truth to them. And so that, okay, I don't want the book to be simply popular and fluffy. A lot of people can do that and say you can trust the Bible, it's true, or it's historical. I wanted to get into the really serious academic side to it, because if we don't convince the professors and the teachers, then there's not going to be much of an improvement in the situation. And I have received some wonderful emails from people, some I know, some I don't, saying, I didn't know that before. Like even in
Yes.
reference to the introduction, no idea what Papias actually was saying in the early second century about how the Gospels got written. I wanted to revisit that. There are new manuscripts available that scholars don't even know about that have relevance for understanding how history was written, how the ancients understood that, and how this makes sense of what the church fathers in the second century were saying. So it was really, I had to just start at the foundation and work my way up.
I think part of what I hear you saying, I wasn't going to ask you this, but just really occurred to me very strongly that your book would be a great tool for the pastor who wants to seriously understand the preservation of Christianity in the earliest texts, church fathers and manuscripts themselves. Maybe you could comment on that a little bit, speak to the pastoral end of this and how this could be used for pastoral ministry.
Oh, gladly. Thanks for asking, Henry. I was so disappointed when, in the aftermath of Bart Ehrman's popular book, Misquoting Jesus, hearing anecdotally mostly stories about people quitting the ministry because they no longer had confidence that the New Testament text could be trusted, or the Gospels have been garbled and who knows really what Jesus said or did. There is no excuse for that. That is wrong. And Bart Ehrman, of course, knows that. Real scholars know that. How can the pastors be, many pastors be in the dark like that? So I'm really hoping that clergy, I know they're busy and they've got a lot going on, but they need to know the issues better. And they're there, the data, the proof, the evidence, it's all there. And I pull it together in the covers of one book, and you can look at all of it. You don't need to be confused when somebody says, well, the real Jesus is in the Quran,
Right.
or in the Talmud,
Right.
or there's some evidence out there, or the papyri. It's all there, and you can review it and see that, hey, you have every reason to have confidence in the Gospels. The text has been preserved, and what Jesus really taught and said and so on and did, it's in the Gospels. But you now have the information, and so you know that with conviction, and you can teach your congregations that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, really one of the most interesting parts of what you bring to the table here in this discussion, a lot of people are not aware of, and that is the length of time that people would tend to preserve texts in the ancient world. It's really fascinating.
There are two patristic comments that scholars long ago found unbelievable. Tertullian, writing at the end of the second century, around the year 190 or so, he's criticizing heretics who distort and twist what Paul teaches. And he says, look, if you don't believe me, you can look at the originals themselves, which are still in the destination cities where Paul wrote his letters. And he mentions Romans, the Corinthian letters, the Thessalonian letters, and so on. The letters are still there. And the word he uses in this Latin text is authenticae epistolae, which literally means the autographic or original letters. And that really bothered scholars. They thought, how could that be? Paul's letters would be over 100 years old. They'd be 135, 140 years old. Could papyrus letters in antiquity last that long? And another church father, Bishop Peter of Alexandria, writing around the year 300 or so, talked about how it was just miraculous that the original copy of the Gospel of John, the autograph of John, thanks to God's providential care, still existed. And this was after a period of persecution. Well, that would make the original Gospel of John over 200 years old. And so scholars thought, these guys, this must be some kind of puffed up apologetic. How's that possible? Well, we have the ancient writers, pagan writers, talking about autographs of Aristotle that were 250 years old. That's even older. We had other references to old books that were 300, 400, in a few cases, even 500 years old. Is this possible? Well, then along came Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, where we started finding thousands and thousands of papyri beginning in the 1890s, right on into the 20th century. And in some cases, whole libraries had been thrown out, all the books together. And because they were in a certain layer that could be dated, and I know, Henry, you and many of your listeners know about archaeology and what's called stratigraphy, where we can date the layers. And here would be a layer in the ground that would date, say, to the 4th century AD, but the manuscripts in the basket of books thrown out dated to the 1st or 2nd century, which means these writings were 200 and 300 years old. We found the same thing at Herculaneum. When Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it cooked a whole bunch of books, turned them into carbon. Yeah, they're very brittle, but with X-ray, we can read them, we can study the handwriting, and we can deduce how old they were when suddenly they were fried in the year 79. And guess what? Some of them are 200 and 300 years old. So we have archaeological evidence and testimony from pagans that supports what the early Christian fathers were saying. This is staggering. This means that the autographs of the New Testament writers, many of them were still in circulation 100, 200 years and venerated, studied, copied by early Christian pastors and bishops and so on. And this helps explain why the New Testament text remains stable, which is not the case with other writings that are not as well attested.
Yeah, that's a power-packed argument, and I think in and of itself, I think the church fathers should have been taken more seriously. But I guess one could try to say, well, that's apologetic puff, like you said. They're just trying to make a point. You don't really know that, Tertullian. But now, what you've brought here is this matrix of evidence. And as I was reading through your book, the other thing is just people with private libraries would pass them on to their descendants. And these libraries sometimes were several centuries old. So you have, and plus all the examples that you just gave as well as part of this sort of matrix of data. I found it really fascinating. It makes very plausible what Peter and Tertullian had to say.
Absolutely. The other thing that we need to underscore, the general public just might not understand this or appreciate it. Books are cheap today. You can buy a paperback book brand new for $10.
Yes.
How many of us have purchased books just to read on the airplane as we pass through an airport? I've done that many times. And the book gets read once or twice, the spine cracks, pages loosen up, we throw it away. That was not how books were treated in antiquity. They were dreadfully expensive. And some of these books are, they're made of leather and bound together and so on, dreadfully expensive. It'd be like buying an automobile. And the idea of just throwing it out. And for early Christians, they venerated the apostles. And the idea that the original Romans or the original Matthew, after a few years, maybe it's getting a little wrinkled, a little dog-eared. Oh, just throw it out in the trash. That is ridiculous. They were, and that's why the church fathers tell us they were venerated, they were treasured and kept for a long time. And it turns out the pagans were the same way.
Yeah.
And they appreciated their great writers and kept their autographs and early copies for centuries.
And one of the points you do bring up here is the stabilizing influence that these autographs would have had. People could have brought their own manuscripts to these churches to double check that, to make sure that there's not a lot of errors introduced.
Well, yes, and having an accurate text was very important. In the pagan world, religion tended to be just uh, going through performance and ritual. The pagans recognized Jews and Christians are people of the book. Having the text just right was very important to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see, and it makes a lot of sense when you take it into its totality, what I call the matrix of evidence. Now, Dr. Evans, some of these gospels that are sort of floating around out there that are not the four claim to be gospels: the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary, and so on. I'd like you to introduce the audience to these works, give them an idea. Well, what are they all about? And then you and I are going to build on that.
Well, there are basically two types of works that are outside the New Testament. There are types of works that are not controversial. They don't really want to change the image of Jesus that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament, but they just want to extend it. They're interested in Jesus's childhood. They're interested perhaps in some other types of teachings or miracles he may have performed. The Gospel of Peter, for example, it's basically proto-Orthodox. There's nothing really strange about it in terms of teaching, but it's it's an apologetic. It wants to increase the number of very credible witnesses who see the resurrection. So you have that kind. But the Gospel of Thomas, and especially the overtly Gnostic Gospels, they're interested in introducing brand new teaching where Jesus begins to teach things that they themselves value, a worldview that they value. The Gnostics believe in two gods, a good God and a bad God. And so, and of course, the good God, you have to reach him not through the cross of Jesus, not through faith in Jesus, but special knowledge he reveals so that you can work your way up through the various layers of heaven and end up in the highest heaven. And so it's this second group that is of special interest because they have, honest to goodness, brand new teachings, strange teachings. And it was with those writings that church fathers like Irenaeus and others wrestled and fought, Tertullian, Origen, and others, because they saw them as a serious threat that would move the church away from a correct understanding of Jesus to heretical ideas.
Yeah, and it's interesting in your book when you talk about that. So that gives a good introduction to people, just a generic overview. And Gnosticism, that special knowledge, that knowledge of we have this special knowledge and you don't. It goes totally against the teaching of the gospel. The gospel is for everyone who's willing to welcome it. And so that's one contrast. The other is, I'd like you to comment a little bit about this tendency in academia to try to make these texts earlier and the New Testament later. You mentioned that in your book, and I found that a very interesting phenomenon. It seems very biased to me, but you can comment on that.
Well, of course. And if you're a New Testament scholar, that basically means you work with first century texts. Okay? Well, here's the problem. If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they're early. If Thomas is written 120, 150, or as I think, closer to 180, it's not really part of the New Testament. It's much later. It's 2 generations later. It's second century. It's part of church history. Well, if you want to say that the image of Jesus, the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas is as valid as the image you have of Jesus in the first century Gospels, you need to make Thomas earlier.
Right.
And you make the canonical Gospels a little later. And the idea is you get everybody sort of at the end of the first century, beginning of the second, and that's egalitarian. Now they're all sort of chronologically on the same page.
Yeah.
And that's what's going on. And so you get some of these ideas that don't make any sense, turning a blind eye to obvious second century features. And then, of course, the one that really bothers me is to simply change the evidence. To say, well, yeah, I know we have 3 fragments of Thomas that are in Greek. We have the whole Thomas translated into the Coptic language, the Egyptian language. But what I'm talking about is an hypothetical early form of Thomas that would fit in the first century. Well, nobody knows that ever existed. And so hypothetical evidence is then taken as gospel, so to speak, and dated to the first century. And there is no evidence of it. It's
Yeah.
just the scholar is simply making that up.
Yeah, now that's interesting, that extrapolation that occurs, that presupposition that occurs, that doesn't make its way out into the popular discussion. So, regular people in the church get the impression that there's a basis for this redating or earlier dating. And what I hear you saying is there's really not a basis for it. It's based on scholarly speculations.
Absolutely. There isn't any manuscript evidence that suggests that. In the New Testament manuscripts, you do see the odd thing added to the text hundreds of years later. But the vast majority of the manuscripts we have don't have those things. That's why we can identify them. Well, at least there you have evidence. But in the case of the Gospel of Thomas, we only have what we have, three fragments of Greek, and then the one whole of in Coptic, and it dates to the 4th century, by the way. And so, how in the world you can extract from that a first century version that you think is just as old as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and therefore contains potentially the authentic Jesus, that is simply special pleading. But what destroys it is no matter what you do with Thomas, and just for fun, I'll sit back and say, okay, strip it down, create what you think is the first century version of it, and I'll show you there's no verisimilitude. There's nothing there that reflects first century Israel, nothing there that reflects the historical Jesus. And this is why archaeologists never make use of the Gospel of Thomas. They find it of no value.
Yeah.
They make use of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Josephus all the time, but they never use Thomas.
Yeah, that's the relationship between the study of the text and the archaeology. Same thing with the book of Acts, first century context.
Absolutely. The evidence for the late date of Thomas is simply overwhelming. If you just allow the evidence to stand, if you read and study what we have and not speculate about what it might have been, generations earlier, that's just sheer gratuitous speculation. The Gospel of Thomas consistently, from beginning to end, reflects the late 2nd century of Syria, Eastern Syria, where there was interest in esoterica, that privileged special knowledge that insiders alone have. It was very ascetic. Jesus is a vegetarian. He's all about poverty. He's against marriage. Sex in any situation, even in marriage, is bad. And on it goes. Well, we have an exact match with these ideas in certain circles in Syria, up north and to the east. This does not reflect the world of Jesus in the 1st century. It reflects a later time, a different place. The evidence for that is huge. In fact, there are distinctive readings in Thomas, the way Jesus' teaching is paraphrased, that matches the diatessaron. That is a harmony of the four gospels blended together by Tatian, who's a native of Syria. And so, in blending the four Gospels together, he created distinctive readings, and some of those readings are in the Gospel of Thomas. And so, that's just more evidence that Thomas is from a later time and from a different place. And the idea that somehow it's early 1st century or it's as early as Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's just no evidence for that. You have to force the evidence, you have to change the evidence, and that, of course, is not proper, responsible historical work.
Yeah, this is one of the points that you bring up in your book. We're talking about Jesus and the manuscripts. And one of the points you do bring up here is looking closely at the way that the Gospel of Thomas is written. Now, you mentioned Tatian. He harmonized the four Gospels. So what you're saying is there's ways that he wrote the text in this harmonization that only appear, that were created by him, essentially. So if they appear in the Gospel of Thomas, they had to come from Tatian, which was 2nd century. Is that the argument?
That is the argument, and that's widely recognized too. Tatian scholars who are concerned with the diatessaron, they observe that. Usually those scholars have no problem seeing Thomas is late second century. In fact, one or two Syrian scholars actually argued that Thomas was as late as the year 200. I think that's a little too late
Okay.
because by the time we get into the 220s, 230s, church fathers know of Thomas and begin talking about it. We have a Greek manuscript of Thomas that dates to about that time, and so on. And so I think that Thomas probably shouldn't be dated any later than about 180, but it can't be dated earlier than 170 because then you can't explain how the author, the compiler of Thomas, knew the Diatessaron. The Diatessaron was written in the 170s.
Yeah, it is. That's good logical historical argument. You know, when I'm reading through your book, I'm thinking about, I'm not a specialist, but I can follow an argument that makes sense, that's based on the data and based on, you know, the logic of the force of your argument really is overwhelming in my view. Now, another part of your matrix of argumentation is that Gospel of Thomas is not seen in any of the church fathers' literature until Hippolytus of Rome, which is 220, 225, 230, something like that. And Eusebius refers to it, I believe, as well. Why don't you comment on that a little bit? Because that's important, that those church fathers witnessing to these texts.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I engage the scholarship of Stephen Patterson mostly, simply because I think he's the best of the Gospel of Thomas scholars who argues for an early date. I respect his work. We did our PhDs at the same school, and he argues that the earliest draft of Thomas could be in the 70s AD. That would make Thomas as early as probably Matthew and Luke, and probably earlier than John. So that puts Thomas right there in the same chronological neighborhood as the canonical Gospels. But then what I counter, and he and I actually have had debates on this in a very pleasant collegial way, but I then wonder, how is it that Thomas stays below the radar for 150 years? If Thomas is written in the 70s, why isn't that nobody talks about it until the 220s, as you just said? And so you have Origen, you have Hippolytus, and then as you go on through the third century, a few more people know of it, and right on into the time of Eusebius in the fourth century and beyond. How is Thomas so unknown for so long? Compare that to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're being quoted, alluded to in the first century. By the time you get into the early second century, they're being explicitly discussed by Papias on into the time of Justin Martyr in the 140s, 150s.
Yeah.
This cannot be said for Thomas. Thomas remains unknown until the third century. To me, that's a major argument against antiquity.
Yeah, I mean, if this gospel was written so early, and we see these other church fathers that you mentioned mentioning it so early, especially before 150, because you know that's when you would expect to see it, and you know, you only see the church fathers talking about the four canonical gospels. It's quite remarkable.
You know, there's another very important point too, and that is the Gospel of Thomas is familiar with about one half of the New Testament.
Right.
Years ago, I prepared an index with a couple of colleagues. It was published, I think, in '93, something like that. And we wanted to show how much of the New Testament and apocryphal writings wind up in some of the Nag Hammadi texts. And that would include the Gospel of Thomas, found in Nag Hammadi Codex number 2. And it turned out I was amazed. I had no idea. We worked our way systematically through all 114 sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, and we have anywhere from as few as 13, as many as 15 of the 27 books of the New Testament are quoted or alluded to in Thomas. How in the world could Thomas be first century and know that much of the New Testament? And that's a truism. Scholars know that.
Yeah.
There weren't New Testament books, Henry. If you and I went back in a time machine to the year 98, we could not find a copy of a New Testament and, get the whole thing, because it's still scattered. Individual books are circulating. So you can't know half of the New Testament until well into the second century.
Yeah. That's a very forceful argument you lay out in your book as well. Another point that I thought was important, that's important here, is the circulation of the four Gospels together in codices, and you never see them with another Gospel connected to them. Maybe you could build on that thought too. That's part of the sort of matrix of evidence here.
Oh, that's a very good point. And what that shows, contrary to the popular view in some circles today, that some of these writings were never considered canonical candidates. If they really were seen as candidates for inclusion amongst the writings of authoritative scripture, then why aren't they ever in collections of authoritative scripture? You never find the Gospel of Thomas, for example, along with Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. You never do. And then when we do find these writings, they're always clustered together. They're segregated. And so the Nag Hammadi codices, these are 13 leather-bound codices. And then we could add others, like the Chacos Codex that was found more recently, and still others. And there are no biblical writings included. They're all extra canonical. They're outside. The other thing about Thomas, don't forget, the Gospel of Thomas begins with the words, these are the secret words
Yes.
of the living Jesus, which Thomas wrote down. Secret implies they're not public. And the early church understood canonical writings as the writings to be read in public. And so this whole idea, popular in some circles today, that Thomas ought to be added to the New Testament, or Thomas was unfairly excluded from the canon of Scripture by various church leaders or Emperor Constantine or something like that, is utter nonsense. The people who produced Thomas didn't want it read publicly. They wanted it to be studied privately.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your book, Eusebius, really not only mentions it, but it says that this is destructive to the church. So there's a theological argument that's built into this too, but it's part of a larger pieces of evidence that you bring about. Now, let's shift just slightly. We wanted to talk a little bit about some of these other ones, like the Gospel of Peter, or you might want to talk about the Gospel of Jesus' wife, which turned out to be a complete fraud. That's a lesson for the church. Maybe you could talk about that, but I'll let you go whatever direction you want.
Well, the Gospel of Peter is an interesting example. It isn't taken very seriously by anyone. It doesn't introduce heretical ideas, but some people have tried to argue that in an earlier form, so here we go again, take the evidence, change the evidence, try to date it earlier. But what it clearly is, and I think it's a good illustration of this, it extends the guard at the tomb tradition you have in Matthew. And it does this to counter second century critics who are saying, why should we believe in the resurrection? Who were the witnesses? Hysterical women? Is that the best you can do? And so whoever wrote the Gospel of Peter, probably in the 140s, 150s, middle of the second century, he did better. He had the Roman guards, the centurion, Jewish elders spending the night in a cemetery guarding the tomb. The whole town, everybody sees angels come down to the tomb, the stone roll aside, a very tall Jesus come out of the tomb. This is a reckless, exaggerated apologetic that tries to answer objections in the second century. That's how we date these things. We ask ourselves, in what time period does it really fit best? The Gospel of Peter fits best middle of the second century. Gospel of Thomas fits best end of the second century.
I think what I hear you saying is the Gospel of Peter is not a Gnostic text saying here's secret knowledge, but here's a clumsy, clunky apologetic for the resurrection of Christ. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. Celsus, writing around the year 160, Celsus was a severe critic of early Christianity, and one of the things he camps on is we shouldn't believe in the resurrection because the witnesses were hysterical, frightened, women. They were nobodies.
Yeah.
If the resurrection of Jesus was seen by important people, including the people who persecuted him and crucified him, then we could believe it. Well, the Gospel of Peter is answering that objection, and that's precisely what he does. He writes an account where the risen Jesus is witnessed by his enemies.
Yeah, I've always found interesting too the elevation of women by the Lord, that they were the witnesses in a culture that basically responded to women or thought of them in the way that you just described. And whoever wrote the Gospel of Peter is making a fundamental mistake by trying to say things that didn't happen. God put these women there as the witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. It's really remarkable.
Well, yeah, let me build on what you just said, Henry. You're right on the money. If the gospel accounts of the resurrection were fictitious, then they would have written the account more the way the Gospel of Peter was written. They would have had men there. They would have had important people. Pilate would have been a witness. But no, they tell the truth. This is what happened. It, in fact, was women who went to the tomb and saw Jesus. That smacks of truth, not exaggeration and myth.
Yeah, I like it a lot. Now, Dr. Evans, let's talk about some other items that you have documented extensively that mention Jesus, mentioned some theology of the New Testament. We're talking about amulets, magic texts, probably things that people have not really heard much about, but I thought they were fascinating.
Well, in the last segment, we talked about how the Gospel of Peter invents a story about having hostile witnesses observe the resurrection. Well, what's interesting? We have outsiders. We have people who are not Christians, who don't believe orthodox things, so to speak, about Jesus. Nonetheless, they testify to his healing power. And that's the stuff you're talking about, the magical texts, including amulets, uh, metal lamellae, ceramic magic bowls. Jesus's name is mentioned in texts that are Jewish and pagan, where he's being appealed to. In one of them, he's called the God of the Hebrews, which is not the way Jews would talk, or Christians for that matter, but pagans might. They appeal to the God of the Hebrews, Jesus, for healing, protection from evil spirits, protection from various curses, protection from the evil eye, and so forth. And I think that's a very significant testimony. Some of this stuff, by the way, is first century. It's that old. It shows us that even in the non-Christian world, where they might not have a good understanding of who Jesus really is, nonetheless, they're aware that Jesus is powerful like nobody else and can command even the wicked, unclean spirits and heal people. And so we have this strange left-handed testimony, as it were, or a left-handed endorsement of who Jesus really is.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're almost quasi-hostile witnesses. They're not hostile because they're adding Jesus to their own paganism. So it's a sort of a syncretization going on, but it's evidence of Jesus and his power. The other thing is it's almost embarrassing to bring this up, but I should bring it up because some people out there may have heard these claims that Jesus never existed. And these kind of texts are the kind of things that you go, come on, what is this silly nonsense? I mean, there's a website out there that's called that, and people in the church are confronted with this, even as absurd as it sounds.
Well, Henry, let's save that for another show, shall we? I can go on and on for hours about these mythicists and how they throw evidence under the bus. I mean, it's mentally pathetic. It's really tragic. But to go back to the magic text, Jesus becomes well known immediately. There are two texts that I can mention, both of them in Greek. One of them is on a papyrus that calls Jesus the God of the Hebrews. But in this text, it refers to the temple with the altar whose flame is always burning. Well, that's not true after 70, when the temple's destroyed and the altar's knocked down. And so this text is pre-70 and is already referring to Jesus as divine. That is a very early testimony. Then there's a ceramic cup, a magic cup found in the harbor at Alexandria about 12, 13 years ago. And I've been in touch with the archaeologists who found it. And on the cup, it says, and it implies the magician has his power or is able to do whatever it is he does through Christ.
Yes.
And they think that it was an old cup. It predates Jesus, but then this was inscribed on it in the middle of the 1st century. So we have two very early testimonies to the power of Jesus by pagans.
Yeah.
And so I think, he existed and was well known to be a powerful healer.
Yeah, and pagans are not orthodox. They don't have if you want to try to make an apologetic argument, they're quasi hostile witnesses in a sense. Now, the cup that you just mentioned, I believe there's a picture in your book. Is that correct? Am I right about
there
that?
Is. Yeah.
Okay, so we, folks can see that in the book. If that dating is correct, we're not talking about in Israel. We're talking about in Alexandria, Egypt. That's the gospel's already made its way down there. This very early.
Well, Henry, that's where that papyrus comes from too. And so you have a papyrus from Egypt by a pagan referring to Jesus as God, who will protect you from evil spirits. And the dating suggests that whenever this was written, the temple in Jerusalem still stood.
Yeah, that's absolutely remarkable. And that's such a significant cataclysmic event in terms of dating, like the way that ancient writers talk about it. It's the before and after. I mean, it's the cataclysm of Judaism. And so that demarcation is very easy to identify in written records. Well, just summarize the best you can, the importance of what you're doing here in the book and an encouragement to the people of God.
I think it's very important that people who take the Bible seriously understand the facts. There's nothing to run away from. There's nothing to be afraid of. We have manuscripts that are very old, and we have a lot of them. There is no mystery. There is no uncertainty. We're not left wondering, how many chapters did Matthew originally have? Or was the Sermon on the Mount original? Or did he really pray the Lord's Prayer? We don't have any questions like that. We have many, many manuscripts. And the other thing about it, too, the basic outline of Jesus's ministry, his public teaching, his public miracles, his rejection at the hands of the ruling priests, his crucifixion by the Romans, and his resurrection, that's actually attested in various sources outside the New Testament. So the New Testament story, the gospel story, is not some pious fiction about somebody who never lived, and we're writing myths and we have no idea what he really said or did. That's the stuff of nonsense. The stuff of scholarship, the stuff of real manuscripts and real artifacts is rock solid.
Well, that's a tremendous word, Dr. Evans. Thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you for what you do in scholarship and for support of the church at large. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
If you're looking for more on this kind of stuff, Dr. Evans was the host of a documentary called Fragments of Truth, and we'll put a link to that where you can find it in the show notes, and also his book, Jesus and the Manuscripts. And of course, Dr. Evans has lots of other books and articles that are out there. We're not going to link to all of them, but if you do a quick search, they're really easy to find. And if you really want to see some of the original manuscripts, there's an ongoing project to digitize these fragments from around the world that are on papyrus and stuff, specifically the New Testament. And it's being done by the Center for New Testament Manuscripts. So those are pretty cool if you want to check them out too. I mean, they're all in Greek, but, they still look old and stuff. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.